Hi, everyone. I'm Crista Cowan. I'm the corporate genealogist here at Ancestry. Today, we are going to be talking about some tips for finding ancestors on Ancestry that are not from the US. Now, of course, we have billions of historical records from the US, but Ancestry has billions of records from 88 countries around the world. And very often what happens is, particularly here in the US, for our US customers, we research back to the immigrant ancestor and then we get stuck because we don't know where to go next. So whether you are here in the US trying to research an immigrant ancestor, or whether you are in Canada or the UK or Ireland or Germany, we're going to focus on some of those areas of the world today and talk about what specific records you can find to continue your family history journey. Now, I am in a little bit of a different environment today, so hopefully the internet holds up and the sound is okay here. Usually I'm in the studio at the Ancestry offices, but I am traveling for work meetings this week, and so I still wanted to connect with you for our Wednesday virtual event and have this really important conversation about finding your non-US ancestors on Ancestry. Now, if your family is not from Canada or the UK or Ireland or Germany, I think you're still going to find some value in what we're going to talk about today, because there are some basic principles or methodologies in family history that you can learn that will help you no matter where in the world your family is from. If you want a refresher, if you're watching this live, you can't do this right now, but if you're watching the recording of this on YouTube, you can hit pause, go find the video I did 2 weeks ago, which was about finding your immigrant ancestors. Because one of the very first things you need to know about finding non-US ancestors is you need to know where they are from. It doesn't matter if your family came from somewhere in Ireland or somewhere in Germany, but particularly if they came from one of those two countries, it's not enough to know that they were from that country. You need to know specifically where in that country they are from. That's a really important piece to this, because most of the records, particularly in those two countries, though it does affect other countries as well, most of the records in those countries are held locally. They were created locally. You have to know what local area to go to find the records that you're going to need. That's a really important thing. So if you have not yet researched your immigrant ancestor enough to know exactly where in Ireland or where in England they came from, I would strongly encourage you to go back and watch that video from 2 weeks ago and just go through the exercise of finding all the records that you can in the country that they ended up in, whether that was the US or Canada or Australia. Find all the records you can to see if you can pinpoint a specific location in the country of origin. That's going to give you the most chance of success. I have an immigrant ancestor named John O'Brien. He came over sometime, we think, in maybe the 1840s or 50s. He did serve in the US Civil War for the state of Iowa. Now, throughout his life, he told lots of stories. Sometimes he was born in Ireland and he immigrated with his father as a teenager. Sometimes he was born in Ohio, sometimes in Illinois, sometimes in Iowa. All the records report something different. And so we're currently stuck with him because I can't even narrow down which John O'Brien he is in Iowa before he joined the Civil War. In the 1860 census, there are 11 John O'Briens living in the counties around where he enlisted. And it's possible that he's not even one of them. He could have come from Ohio or from Illinois earlier or after the 1860 census, but before he enlisted. And so he could be an entirely different individual altogether. So I still have a lot of research to do here in the US before I can just jump to Ireland, because by the time I get to Ireland, even though my mom's DNA gives me a general idea of where in Ireland I could be looking, there are going to be hundreds of John O'Briens, and I need to have enough information that I can confidently identify which John O'Brien he is, both in the US and in the right place in Ireland. So my number one tip for you today is this: If you are researching ancestors outside of the United States or Canada, you need to know where exactly they came from. And if they are an immigrant, then you need to do all the research tips that I shared in that last video to pinpoint exactly where they came from in the old country. That's going to give you the most success of finding the right people in the right places. Okay. Okay, tip number two. Tip number two is if you are looking for family members particularly in Ireland and Germany, I'm going to focus on those two countries a lot today. But again, the methodologies will apply elsewhere. And we'll dive into some actual records here in just a few minutes. But if you are researching ancestors in those countries, you need to understand a little bit about the geopolitical changes that have happened, because the timeline of when your ancestor may have immigrated either from one of those countries to the US or Canada or migrated around within Europe, you need to understand a little bit more about boundary changes and how the government kind of functioned. So in Germany prior to the 1860s was basically just a series of kingdoms and duchies. And so what you have is you have a lot of local record collections, local records being created. Mostly it's going to be focused on church records, though there are some town records that are super useful as well. But Germany as a country, as a unified country, did not exist before then. And so they spoke a Germanic language and different dialects in different places. And the boundaries of what we now know as that country, even from the 1860s right up through the 1980s, were changing constantly. And so knowing exactly where a thing took place then becomes really critical in a country like Germany. You will also know that not only did the boundaries of Germany change over time, but sometimes there are other countries or names of places that no longer exist. So I have immigrant ancestors who came in the 1850s to Texas, and they came from, they spoke German. They claimed German identity. On the census, they said they were from Germany, but every once in a while they would put Prussia. That's Prussia with a P, right? And as a little kid, I used to think, why is my family from Russia if they're Germans? Well, that was because Prussia as a place doesn't exist anymore. And so I had to learn again about, well, what was considered Prussia? What were the boundaries of the country at the time that my family lived there or at the time that they were born, reporting on this information decades later. And one of the things that you'll quickly learn, especially as you're doing research throughout all of Europe, is that as those boundaries change, sometimes people claim birth in one place, but it's because that's what it's called now versus what it was called then. So you'll see that a lot with Eastern Europe, places like Poland and Ukraine and Russia and Latvia and Lithuania. And like you'll see different people claiming different things on census records as their birthplace. And it just depends on who's asking the question, how the question was asked, and what the country was called, both at the time that the event occurred and years later when they were asked the specific question. So kind of start to think through what a timeline of geopolitical borders sounds way scarier than it is, what that might mean for your family history. I said we were going to talk mostly about Germany and the UK today, but Italy, same situation. Italy did not become a unified country until much later than we currently think of it as the boundaries that we think of it. And before that, it was just a series of different kingdoms and smaller, sometimes warring factions throughout what we now know of as Italy. And so you have people who proudly claim, Siciliano, his ancestry, or Napolitano, Naples, I don't remember what they're called, or Florentines, or like you have people throughout Italy who claim ancestry that often relates to some of those original geopolitical borders or identities. So think about that. Now, Ireland is kind of a unique situation as well. Ireland had their civil war in the 1920s. And of course, the The British have always been trying to claim Ireland, and there's lots of, even today, some issues between the British government and the Irish government. And so basically what happened in the 1920s as part of that Civil War, unfortunately, there was what is called the Four Courts Fire. So some bombing because of the war, some records were destroyed. So most of the countrywide records in Ireland that existed prior to the 1920s were destroyed in that fire. And so you've not only got this faction of the country now you've got Northern Ireland, which is those northern counties, and then the Republic of Ireland, which is the rest of the country, which is now, two separate countries on one island. Prior to the 1920s, it was all one country. But because of the loss of those records, you don't have very many countrywide records left for what was all of Ireland prior to that. So that is one of the reasons why it's really important to know exactly where in the country your family came from. So tip 1, figure out exactly where in the country they came from using all the records you can prior to their immigration or after their immigration, so in the place where they landed. And then step 2 is become familiar with the geopolitical borders. This becomes important even in England. Now, England, for most of history, has been pretty set borders, but what has changed over time are the borders of the counties. And records in England, even though they have a nationwide census, records in England often are held at a county level. The county boundaries and sometimes names changed in the 1970s. And so again, if you've got people who were living there before that, you need to understand what those boundaries were. Now, one of my favorite nerdy things is maps. I love a good map. And so I would highly recommend that you find yourself a map of the place where your family lived at the time that they lived there. And there's lots of internet searches you can do for that, but there are also maps available on Ancestry. So let's dive in to the site. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And you are going to see some different resources that we have available on Ancestry for you to understand some of these boundaries. So my favorite resource on the entire Ancestry website, which is no surprise to those of you who ever spend a Wednesday with me, but for those of you who are new here, you're going to get used to this. If you go to search on Ancestry, there is a card catalog on the site. Much like a card catalog in a library, this tells you all of the collections or databases of records that are currently held on Ancestry. As of today, there are 33,851 unique databases on the site. This just allows you to explore what exists. But when it comes to maps, this is one of the only ways to find them. Maps, because they are about places, not people, are never going to show up in your hints. They have to be, you have to intentionally go look for them. So over here in the filters on the left-hand side of the card catalog, you are going to see different categories. And one of those categories in this set of 33,000 databases are 206 databases that are maps, atlases, or gazetteers. And you can then filter by a specific location. So if I was interested, for example, in Germany, I could come here and I could filter to Germany. And there are 6 databases on Ancestry of German maps. And you'll see these are not just maps, there are also gazetteers. Gazetteers, for those of you who aren't map nerds like me, a gazetteer is simply a listing of the places that exist. So as you are looking at a passenger list and you found your immigrant ancestor and you know now where they came from in Germany, but you don't know anything about that place, or if it really even is a place, did they spell it right? Did you interpret it right? You can come here to a gazetteer, and the gazetteer will allow you to look up to see if that place existed. Some of those places still exist, but they are now in different countries. So, for example, my family that came from Prussia, Prussia no longer exists. They were German speakers, they identified as German, but the place where they all lived and were born for generations is now within the boundaries of the country of Poland. And so, like, understanding those changes, understanding that that town where they were all born and baptized still exists, but it's called something different now because now the name is in Polish rather than being in German. So it's similar, but it's not exactly the same. And so being able to look up information in gazetteers and maps is going to be super useful. So there are, you'll see here, maps for all sorts of different places, but I would highly encourage you to go explore those. Some of the maps are countrywide maps, and they're for specific time periods. So, for example, here we have a 1930s general map of Great Britain. That's useful to start to understand because, again, remember the county boundaries were changed in the 1970s. So if your family lived there before that, you need to have an understanding of what the county boundaries were so you know where to go look for records. You'll see here in a minute why that becomes so important. You'll also see other maps with different dates. So we've got parish maps that date from the 1860s to the 1880s. You can see here this old series of maps for England, Wales, Scotland, and the Isle of Man go from 1805 to 1874. So just find a map that accurately reflects the time period that your family lived there. Now, in the case of England, and we'll see here in Ireland in just a minute, sometimes you can get really detailed maps. And that becomes important if you're curious about the specific place where your family lived. So not just the broad country, trying to find the town, what county or state is it currently located in, but also sometimes you can drill down to very specific locations. Gazetteers are also sometimes part of city directories. And so you'll see here in the card catalog, when you look at those maps, gazetteers, and atlases, you'll see gazetteers sometimes paired with a city directory for a specific year. So really great resource. And again, typically these actually never are these going to come up in hints because hints are about people. And what we are talking about is places. Places are so important to understand. They become a main character in the stories of our ancestors' lives. And so if you can dig into learning more about a specific place, not only are you going to have more success in finding your ancestors, but it's going to give you context and understanding for their stories. One of the other things I love about maps, I'm going to just keep nerding out here for a minute and then we'll move on, is I love the topographic, I can't say it, but the topography maps. Basically what they show you is what the terrain was like. And why that's important, let's look at an example here. The History, Topography, and Directory of East Cumberland. That sounds fascinating. Okay, we are going to jump right into the images. These are often old books, and so you're going to just simply flip through them, just like you would a digital book on an e-reader. And you can start to see, advertisements, you'll see information about the community, you'll see names of places, and sometimes names of occupations. Sometimes there will be an abbreviations legend at the beginning. You'll see advertisements for local businesses, which is fascinating and super fun when you find one for your ancestor. Okay, so you start to see some of these maps and always look for explanatory information. And sometimes you have to go back a page or two, but you can start to get a feel for what this place looked like at the time that this particular directory was created. And you're looking for not just where are the towns in relation to the other towns, but you're also looking for things like rivers and mountains and Like, are there physical impediments, which is why I love a good topography map? Are there physical impediments to them going one direction versus the other direction? And when you start to understand that, oh, let's scroll back out here. When you start to understand that, what that does for you is it helps you start to know where to look for records. Because think about this, okay? When you have an ancestor who gets married in a specific town or parish or church, and then they set up their household, and then they start having children, and all of a sudden you realize their children aren't being baptized in the same church that they were married in. And one of the things that you need to pay attention to is, what does that mean? Like, why did they go to this parish? Or what other parishes could they have gone to baptize their children? Why weren't they going to the parish that they lived near? Well, think about things like spring flooding. Maybe there was a river between them and the closest parish church, but all their children were born in the spring, and now you've got this flooding that's happening, and they can't get to their nearest parish church, so they go to one that's a little bit further, but that has no impediments like that. Sometimes you have to look at a map to see things like, how come this girl married this boy from this neighboring village, right? And you realize, oh, well, that's the nearest market town. Or even though these towns were closer, she's marrying somebody from way over here because there's this mountain range in between these two towns. So understanding not just geopolitical borders, but some of the topography of the land helps you understand a little bit more about why they made the choices they made, but it also helps you start to understand where else I could or should be looking for records. Because remember, again, most records, especially the further back in time you go, are going to be held locally. They're going to be collected at a county level, sometimes at a parish level. And so understanding that the lay of the land, as it were, becomes a really important part of this process. And frankly, I find it fun. Again, maybe I'm just a map nerd, but I love understanding the context of the world in which they lived. Sometimes I even like to understand the dirt. Now, here's what I mean by that. One of the things that happens, and we see this over and over and over again in family history and social sciences, is as people immigrate, oftentimes they immigrate to a place that has a similar climate or the same kind of dirt, because that means they know how to grow things in that place. And so when you start to look at, oh, well, where did they end up in Georgia or North Carolina or Ohio? And you look at what grows in that area, and then you look at what grows in the place they came from in Europe, you start to realize, oh, a lot of these people came to places where they could grow the same kind of crops because it's something they were familiar with. So all those little details about your ancestor stories, so many times we just want to follow the leaves or chase the next record or find the next generation. But what I want to encourage you to do is go really deep and find the stories and understand the context of their lives. Because not only is it more fun and more interesting and more, I think it's more, it does more honor to their memory to tell their whole story. I love doing that, but also it helps you ensure you're not going to make mistakes. You're not going to be climbing someone else's family tree because you grabbed the wrong person who just happened to have the same or a similar name or even came from the same place. And that's what I want for you. I want you to be climbing your family tree, not someone else's. So getting familiar with the place and the boundaries and the land and the neighboring towns and villages is a really useful exercise, especially when you're doing research outside of the United States, though I do it in the US as well. Okay, so let's now talk about, we are going to spend about 10 minutes each on several different countries and specific records that are available to those countries. Now, most of you will receive hints for many of these records once you get your family information entered into your family tree. But again, keep in mind, same name, same place, different people. So just because you get a hint on Ancestry does not mean it is for your person. So the more you know and understand, the more likely you are to make a good determination. Is this record I'm being hinted really for this person or this family, or is it for an entirely different family with just similar information? Let's start in England. So in England, they, like the US, take a census. That census is taken, like the US, every 10 years. However, they take their censuses on the ones. So here in the US, we take our censuses on the zeros. We started taking censuses in 1790. The last census was in 2020. The next one will be in 2030. And here in the US, we have a 72-year privacy law, which means the most recent available census is the 1950 census. The 1960 census will become public in 2032. In England, they take their censuses on the one, and the oldest publicly available census is 1841, and the most recent publicly available census is 1921. So in England, they take them on the ones, and they have a 100-year privacy law. So the 1921 census, most recent publicly available census. Unfortunately, the 1931 census was destroyed, and the 1941 census wasn't taken because they were in the middle of World War II. So the next census that's going to come out in the UK is going to be the 1951 census in 2051. So we're looking at a long time before another census is available in the UK. Those censuses, starting in 1841, 1851, they are going to have, kind of like in the US, minimal information and then more information as time goes on. Those forms get fuller, more robust, more questions are asked. So if you haven't explored UK censuses, just know that as you're working your way back in time, if your family was in the UK in 1921, 1911, 1901, you're going to have a lot of really great information. But as you start getting back into the 1800s, the information is going to become more and more sparse. So if your family like mine, when my family immigrated from England, they came in the 1850s and the 1860s. So I can find them in the 1851, 1861 census, but I have to be really careful to make sure it's them, because really you just have some lists of names. And what they did in the early censuses in England was they rounded the ages. So rather than being precise about ages, you're going to see some rounding of those ages. Now, one of the ways that Ancestry has set up these records on our site is by breaking out the UK census. So we have England as a separate database from the Channel Islands, from the Isle of Man, and from Wales. So it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4 different databases for the 1841 census, and that's because there's different forms. Sometimes in the case of Wales, for example, you also have different languages represented, and so those are 4 separate databases. Let's just take a look here at some of the records that you're going to see, and we'll talk about a little bit about that rounding error that you're going to see on some of these records. One of the instructions in the census, in some of these early censuses, was to round the ages. And so if you see a whole page of censuses, my Zoom is being a little wonky, there we go. If you see a whole page of censuses where everybody's age is a 0 or a 5, you know that the census taker rounded. When you can see more precise ages, 62, 51, 24, 19, 18, that indicates that they likely did not round those ages to a nearest 5 or 0. You'll see here that in 1851, much like in the US, there is no relationship. They have relationships. Unlike in the US, we didn't start including relationships in the census until 1880. In England, they included them much earlier. So that is one benefit you're going to have when you're doing research in England, is that you're going to have those relationships to the head of household listed in those earlier censuses, unlike in the US, where 1850, 1860, 1870, we have no clue sometimes how those people in that household are related. We can sometimes infer some things, make some hypotheses, but we don't always have that hard evidence. Here we have that information. So censuses are a fantastic resource for anybody, foundational resource for genealogy. Really great that we have them available in the US and in England, in the UK. Scotland also takes a census. However, the Scottish census, they have not given Ancestry permission to publish the images. So for the Scotland census, all you are going to have is an index, and then you need to contact the Scottish government to get copies of the images themselves. So Scotland, so the UK, Scotland takes censuses every 10 years, but Scotland only has provided Ancestry with the indexes. Canada also takes a census every 10 years on the ones. They do have some early censuses, 1825, 1842, but then you start to see these consistent censuses in 1851, 61, and so on. Canada, unlike the UK, has a 90-year privacy law. So the most recent publicly available census for Canada is the 1931 Canadian census. The 1941 census will become available in 2031. Had to think about that math for just a second. Okay, now here is the sad news about Ireland. Ireland also takes a census. However, a lot of those census records were destroyed or lost during that Four Courts fire in the 1920s. And so that's why countrywide record collections, that's one of the countrywide record collections that no longer exists. So understanding again what records exist for where is really important. For example, you're going to see some census records for specific counties in specific years. You're going to see some old religious census records or fragments of religious census records. And then you are going to see fragments of censuses from 1821 to 1851 that survive. But when we say fragments, we mean fragments. This is, what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4 decades of census records. And the only thing that survives are 357,000 names from that particular census. From those years. So that is a terrible tragedy when you're doing research, but it's also why it's so important to understand where in Ireland your family is from. Now, there are some more recent censuses, but again, the country of Ireland has not provided Ancestry with the license to publish those. So we do have indexes to those records. But you'll notice that these have the word web in front of them. Anytime you see any database on Ancestry with the word web in front of it, what that means is that Ancestry has found an open source of data on the internet that didn't have any licensing restrictions, and we've been able to put that index on Ancestry. So whenever you find something either in a hint or a search result or here in the card catalog that says web as the first word of the database title, what you want to do is you want to look to see where the information lives. And in this case, the information lives on the National Archives of Ireland website. And so they have these records. Ancestry has been able to publish the index, but again, the images are only available through the National Archives in Ireland. But this index will get you started and get you the information you need to start to work through some of that. Okay, so that is censuses in the UK and Ireland. Now let's talk a little bit about Germany. I mentioned that Germany did not become a unified country until the 1860s. And what that means is that there are census records, but most of those census records are local. There is not a nationwide census that is publicly available outside of that. And so you're going to see that these censuses, some of them date back to 1807, right, 1819, but that they are done by different regions of the country, and that there is not a complete list for the whole country. It's not every place in the country took censuses at every time. So you'll see these smaller censuses for specific regions. If your family's not from that region, of course, there are other records. So let's talk about other records. As a genealogist, you know, and hopefully you know, that looking at broad record collections like a census is a great step when you're first trying to learn about a particular family in your family tree. And I hope that you are learning about families. Oftentimes, new people to family history get stuck in this mentality of, I need to find the parents, and then I need to find the parents, and then I need to find the parents. And they keep trying to just build their family tree back. But what we discover is very often they make a wrong turn and attach the wrong set of parents because they haven't researched the whole family. The best way to make sure you're identifying the right people is to make sure you understand all the people that were in their lives. So when I add my grandfather to the tree, I also add both of his sisters to the tree. Because then when I find somebody that has my grandfather's name and I think, oh, I think I might have found the parents, I can double check and make sure, oh, are they also the parent of these two sisters that I know he has? And that helps me make sure that I'm connecting generations correctly. That's a really basic genealogy methodology, is to make sure you're including entire families. And census records are a great way to build a framework around these entire families that you're putting together. The next step is to dive into civil registration or church records. Civil registration is simply the government's registration of births, marriages, and deaths. And every country started doing it at different times, and they have different privacy laws regarding when those records become publicly available. So civil registration, government registration of births, marriages, and deaths. Church records are the church registration of baptisms. So oftentimes it will include the birth information, marriages, because the state and the church both are concerned with marriage, and then burials. And the burial will often include the death date. So birth, marriage, and death is civil registration. Baptism, marriage, and burial are the church records. Those records, when you work in concert, often provide you with exactly the information that you need to keep growing your family tree and to make discoveries and find stories in your family tree. However, because civil registration only goes back so far and has privacy laws, oftentimes we can't pair church records. We have to augment with church records. So the church records are not only going to fill in the gaps, sometimes they're also going to extend much further. And nowhere is that more prevalent than in England. So when you go to the card catalog on Ancestry, and I'm just going to type in the word parish, one of the things that you will notice is that there are hundreds of databases on Ancestry that are parish records. That is how the records are organized. Let's do it this way. There we go. That is the way that the records are organized in England, because England has a state church, meaning the religion is tied to the government. There's this connection. They've had the same church since Henry VIII broke off from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England. And you have a large percentage of the population where baptisms, marriages, and burials since the 1500s have been performed in England in that particular faith. The records, however, are kept locally. So you have a local parish church that performs those ceremonies, keeps those registers. Sometimes they keep them as what we call blended registers. So you're going to see baptisms, marriages, and burials. This particular collection goes from 1538 to 1812. Those are dates you are going to see a lot in England. 1538 1538, 1538. Those are the earliest, in most cases, parish registers that exist. That's pretty darn early. Then you're going to see 1812. And what happens in 1812 is then you start to see separate registers. So before that, they were blended. So you might see a baptism and then a marriage and then a couple of burials and then a couple of marriages and then a whole list of births. Like they're just going to be in the register in all mixed up order. Starting in 1813, you're going to start to see separate registers for births and baptisms, and then separate registers for marriages and separate registers for burials. And those records then go from 1813 up to whatever date the particular local area has allowed Ancestry to publish. So you'll notice some of them, like this one goes to 1909, this one goes to 1915, this one goes to 1935, this one goes to 1999, right? So it just depends on the local parish and what they allowed to be made public and posted online. Another set of record another record you're gonna find in here that you might be curious about are what we call marriage bans, B-A-N-N-S. In the Church of England, one of the things that was required was for 3 consecutive Sundays before you could get married, you had to publicly announce in the church that you had this intention to marry this person. And when the bans were read, that gave people an opportunity to object if they needed to object, right? Maybe the groom was already married and his wife was not deceased, or maybe, there was something that somebody in the community knew that would prevent that marriage from going forward. And so they read the bans, and that became part of the church record. And so one of the things that you'll sometimes find is bans being read and then no marriage being performed. That's an indication there might be a story there. Sometimes you'll see bans read and then the marriage. Sometimes you won't see the bans read and then you'll see the marriage. And there were some dispensations given for that. We talked a little bit in Facebook Live yesterday about Gretna Greens. So Gretna Greens are basically places where people go to elope because they don't have to go through whatever that process is. Now, in England, Gretna Green was actually the name of a town just over the border in Scotland, where a lot of people who didn't want to go through the process of reading bans, didn't want to wait that 3 weeks, for whatever reason wanted to elope, they would go just across the border into the town or village of Gretna Green, and they would get married there. And so there are marriage registers from Gretna Green that date from 1794. Now, other places, that term, the name of that village, Gretna Green, has become a term that means a place people elope. So basically, Las Vegas is a Gretna Green. There is a couple of places in Indiana, because from other states, they could just come across the border and they could get married easily. So you'll see people who get married in places you might not expect. That could be because the place they were from had more strict requirements about who could get married and the process to get married and how long they had to wait and the license or the bans or and then could they just go somewhere and get married quickly. So sometimes you'll see people get married in odd places, and that's what that means. Now, in Ireland, you are also going to have these church records. So if I come down here, we're going to go back into Europe. We are going to go to Ireland, and then we are going to look at birth, marriage, and death records. And what you're going to see is a countrywide database that dates from 1655 through 1915. This particular database has 25, almost more than 25 million records in this one database. And that is the Catholic parish registers. You'll also see some of those civil registration indexes. Again, 11 million, 6 million, 4 million, birth, marriages, and deaths dating from 1864. So there are some collections that have been made of those local records. But again, you need to be cautious because when you're looking at countrywide collections, it's really easy to my John O'Brien to find a whole bunch of people, 2,091 men named John O'Brien, if you don't know where in Ireland he's from or have a narrow enough birth year. Even with a narrow enough birth year, you'll notice, right? Here's 3 men with the same name born in the fall of 1879, all in 3 different places in the country. So that's the challenge when you're dealing with countrywide collections. You've got to know the more specific details about where they came from. So there are both civil registration records and church records in Ireland. Now let's talk a little bit about church records as it relates to what faith a person practiced. In England, you've got the Church of England. In Scotland, you've got the Church of Scotland. So you've got these religious organizations that are state churches that essentially most of the people in the country are going to be affiliated with their local parish in some way. However, in England, if they did not belong to the Church of England, they were called non-conformists. And it doesn't matter what faith they practiced. They could have been Catholic, they could have been Jewish, like any other faith other than the Church of England is going to be called a non-conformist. And non-conformist records for those churches are oftentimes kept separately, and they are all together in a single database. And so you'll see that you're not going to be looking for Church of England records if your family wasn't a part of the Church of England. You need to look for non-conformist records. So if I come in here and I type in, first I have to spell it right, conformist. Nope. Nope. Okay, let's do it. Oh, because I spelled it wrong. Well, England Church. Playing with the card catalog is oftentimes, it's kind of a fun exercise. I'm looking for how we've titled that database. Let's see if we can do it this way. Non-conformist. There we go. Okay. So non-conformist registers will be anybody who is not a member of the Church of England, where these archives have collected the church records from those of other faiths. And so that is a type of record that exists if your family was living in London and they were Jewish, or if your family was, living in Northumberland and they were Catholic. Like, you're going to have pockets of different faiths in some of those countries. Now, in Germany, you are going to have a large population of the people who are Lutheran. And so there will be a lot of Lutheran church records for those of you who are doing research in Germany. And again, what you're going to notice is that most of these databases start in the 1500s because churches have been keeping records for centuries. Some of the records go through, this one goes through 1985, this one goes through 1971. It just depends again on what the local area has decided to make public. So depending on when your family lived there, you might get lucky with some more recent records, or you might be dealing with having to get back a generation or two to find people in these records. Keep in mind that for both the Church of England records, for the Catholic Church records, for the Lutheran records, typically they're going to be in the native language of the country. So of course the German baptism records are going to be in German. However, as you get further back in time, you're going to notice some changes. Sometimes, for example, in some records, particularly in Catholic Church records, though I have seen it in other records as well, the names and the information in the record might be written in a different language than the language of the country. They might be written in Latin, for example. And so you'll see people's Latinized versions of their names recorded. You'll see some of the words and the relationships listed in Latin words. And so I use Google Translate. I do not speak German. I do not speak Latin, but I can plow my way through a set of German Lutheran or Catholic church records and use Google Translate to help me understand what it is that I'm reading or what it is that I'm looking for. If I know, for example, what the word is for born, married, died, father, mother, husband, wife, like I just make a list of words and translate those, then I keep that handy while I'm looking through the records, and I can make out the information that I need to make out to understand those. So just know Ancestry does not translate records. We transcribe records to create an index for you so that you can search for it. But the actual records themselves, the original records, are going to be in those original languages. So church records, you're going to have the Lutheran church records in Germany. Of course, in Ireland, you are going to have different records because Ireland has both Catholic records and Protestant records. And so you're going to see those start to show up as well. So here you've got Catholic parish registers, you've got those civil or government records again, and then you will also sometimes see lots of Catholic records. You will also sometimes see some of those Protestant records as well. So I encourage you to explore the card catalog. Now, I'm going to give you one more tip before we go, because an hour goes way too fast. So you're going to do the census work, you're going to do the civil registration and the church records work. That's going to help you start to build up the family identity and the stories, start to look for information, look for patterns. That's where some of the best stories are found. But then if you want to fill in the gaps, there are other kinds of records sometimes available. Usually, census records, civil registration, and church records, you are going to get some hints about those. You will also need to search. So Ancestry hints records where either we have a high degree of confidence that this record, information on this record matches the information you put in your tree. We, of course, don't know if it's the same person or a person with the same name, but we give you that hint. Or if somebody else has the same person in their tree that you have in your tree, we will hint to you records they have attached to that person, which again, they may have done right or wrong. So every time you get a hint, you want to review it in light of what you know about this person and their family to see if you can make a decision if this is the right person or not. Sometimes you don't have enough information yet, and so you can just leave it there or click maybe and stick it in the undecided tab on that person, but that holds on to it for you before you can make a decision. Sometimes you have to look at 3 or 4 records or look at records for other family members, but those hints, as you kind of process through them and make some of those discoveries, the next step is always to go search in the databases to see how you can fill in the gaps. If I got a hint for an 1861 census and an 1881 census, but I didn't get a hint for an 1871 census, you better believe I'm searching the 1871 census database to see if I can find the family. Because sometimes I didn't get the hint because their names were not spelled correctly or their ages were off because it was the neighbor who answered the census taker's question and he didn't know how old the kids in the family were. But when I'm looking at it, I can say, oh, that's definitely them, right? So you always look at hints and then you search. But then what I'm going to ask you to do, and this is true whether you're researching in the US or elsewhere, go another layer deeper. Because the next layer is where all of the stories start to just spill out. It's where you start to fill in the little details that make these people real, that make their lives real, that help you start to understand the choices that they made, the occupations they had, the ways that they lived their lives. So what I would like you to do is explore the card catalog to see what other records exist for the place that I am researching. So you can do it at a country level, which is great. And you can start to find things like, here is 1.7 billion records, that's billion with a B, that come out of England newspapers. So newspapers, stories and events, mentions of individuals in newspapers across the country from the 1800s to now. You do have to have either an Ancestry All Access subscription or a separate subscription to newspapers.com to view the images, but this index will tell you if there are mentions of people who have the same name as your ancestor, living in the same place at the same time, so that you can then go dive in and see if this is really them. In a lot of places, electoral registers are a great way to trace people between censuses. That's true of electoral registers and city directories. If somebody's living in one place in one census and somewhere else in the next census, tracing them through electoral registers and city directories gives you an opportunity to see exactly when they might have moved, so that you know where to be looking for civil registration and church records for baptisms of children and marriages in the family that took place in that ensuing decade. So really great resource to fill in the gaps. So you can kind of just start to explore the records by a country level. But if you happen to know that your family is from a specific, for example, county in Ireland or county in Scotland or England, or a specific state in Germany, you can put in the name of that particular place. So I could come in here and I could type in the county in England where my family came from and see what other records exist. Now, I just typed in the word Berkshire, and of course, there is a Berkshire in Massachusetts as well. So you can filter it so that it only shows you the Berkshire in England. And now I have some understanding of some additional records that exist and that might be more specific to the place where my family actually lived. One of the things you're going to start to see as you dive into some of these more specific locations is you're going to start to see these small, tiny little databases. And what these are usually is old family history and local history books. And I would encourage you to go read some of those books. Those are going to give you a flavor for the time and the place that your ancestor lived, even if they aren't mentioned specifically in that book. I just finished reading a book about a place in Berkshire called Radley, which is a little village that I got to visit with my dad and some of his cousins and some of my siblings a couple of summers ago. I had been there once before, but hadn't really done a lot of research on the ground. I'd come home and done a ton of research, and then I took my dad and some of our family back there, and we got to sit on the steps of the little parish church where they had been baptized and married and buried for hundreds of years in that family. And I went to the local historical society and bought a book about the community. And my specific ancestors were not mentioned. Some of the extended family was, but like my great whatever grandparents weren't mentioned. But I got to learn all about the community. And it just gave me such an insight and an appreciation for this family, for why they stayed there for so long, and ultimately for why they immigrated to the United States, because I understood both the land and the time and the place and the politics and the crop growing situation and like all of the push and pull factors that lead people to migrate or to immigrate. And understanding their lives is part of why I do what I do, because I want to understand the choices they made and the stories that they lived, because that ultimately informed how I got to where I am and who I am because of them. So it's not just names and dates and places on a pedigree chart, though I do love a good pedigree chart, but it is also about understanding who they were, and most importantly, making sure you're identifying the right people. So that's all I have prepared for you today. Before you go, would you please in the chat just leave a comment about one new thing you learned today? That's super helpful to me to understand what people are learning, if I'm pacing these Wednesday virtual events correctly for you. But also, I think it's useful for you to actually type out what you learned. You're more likely to remember it. I know at least that works for me. That's all I have for you today. Until next time, I'm Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.